Ah, Deltarune. When Toby released Chapter 1 for free last year in October, I totally brushed it off originally, thinking it would be one of those games I would eventually get around to when I had the time. Even though I had enjoyed Undertale, I wasn't quite ready to hop on board on the hype train for Undertale's sequel. That is, until I finally actually played it. There are so many little secrets hidden in this little demo Toby has provided for us. I had fun seeing what little Easter eggs I could find. Constantly flushing the toilet in Toriel's house to get a rise out of her had me chuckling to myself like a 5-year-old, and I think that's part of what makes Undertale and Deltarune so unique. Not to mention, when I first saw the new battle system and battle theme, oh my god, there's just so much style and charm that you can tell how much love was put into Deltarune. Toby knew what message he wanted to get across with this game, as the setting seems to take place in an alternate universe from Undertale. Toby Fox doesn't want to make Undertale 2, but Deltarune, an experience all on its own. From the animations, to the dialogue, to the characters especially, Lancer is one of my favorite characters of all time. Deltarune feels like a unique and fresh experience, albeit with some influences from Undertale, which brings me to the point of this video. The characters in Deltarune are really what drive the main point home for me, and what makes it so unique and interesting to play through. But why is that? What makes the characters so intriguing and interesting? What makes us feel so invested in the relationships between those characters and feel like we've known them forever when Chapter 1 is a short 2 hours? Now, before we go diving into answering those questions, I know, let's establish something important that we need to agree on before I can blow your mind and make my point. If I had to categorize Deltarune under a gaming genre, I would probably put it under the JRPG category. It has all the elements of a JRPG while still being unique enough to make me hesitate to call it a JRPG. However, that's what we've categorized it as. Okay? Good. Moving forward, typically in a traditional Japanese RPG, you have your protagonist. This protagonist is the main character of our game, and as we progress throughout our JRPG, he develops relationships with people around him, usually in the form of a party that travels along with our hero. They venture from town to town, battling monster after monster, getting stronger, leveling up, yada yada yada, the whole JRPG business. To name an example of what I'm talking about to make my point even more clear, let's take a look at Xenoblade Chronicles. We've got our boy Shulk, his friend Rhine, and a few others battling the Mechon for Colony 9. Shulk's the only one who can wield the Monado, which, let's be honest, makes him OP. Due to this fact, he's the one that plays the most significant role in the story, and everyone takes a backseat to Shulk for the majority of the game. Sure, you still develop relationships between the characters, but when you have such a big plot point centered around your main character, all the side characters are going to get pushed to the side, just like Goku did to everyone in Dragon Ball Z. Okay, I'm getting off topic, but you get the picture. Now, let's compare this to Deltarune. So in Deltarune, we have our main character, Chris. Chris doesn't say a single line of dialogue throughout the entirety of Deltarune. The most character-driven thing he does is at the very end of Deltarune, which we'll get to in a little bit. Chris is an empty shell. The player is meant to take the shoes of Chris, but it's also a bit more complicated than that. You see, in the world of Undertale and Deltarune, there's this thing called saving. The game is very self-aware, and saving the game is a mechanic that certain characters know about, at least in the world of Undertale. It works the same way in Deltarune, and I can prove it. Listen, I know this video is supposed to be about character development, but trust me, this is all gonna come together. Now then, we can assume saving works the same way in Deltarune because of the beginning of the game. After attempting to name your character, just like any other JRPG, wink wink cough cough, the game flat out refuses to let you make that decision and tells the player your name is Chris. Okay. However, After playing as Chris, once you make it to the first save point and overwrite the file, which originally has the player name as Chris, you then overwrite that name with the name you created at the start. Interesting. So, we saved over Chris's save file. This makes us assume the role of Chris in Deltarune, which would explain why Toby portrays him as a silent protagonist. Psst, you'll see why I said that so suspiciously later, so watch the whole video. Now, because Chris is a silent protagonist, this allows for our party members to really take the spotlight in Deltarune. The two characters I'll be focusing on in particular are Lancer and Susie, and how both of these characters and the relationship develop throughout the game. First, let's take a look at Susie. She's introduced as the school bully and is intimidating to the point that she has no friends as well. When talking to her classmates, we, as the player, definitely get the vibe that Susie isn't someone to be taken lightly. So, lucky Chris as he gets paired up with Susie for a group activity, as everyone else was already grouped up. My impression was that everyone had been judging Susie wrongly, as she seemed like a decent enough person, maybe even slightly misunderstood. Wait, what? Did she just eat chalk? Wait, one of the first lines she says to you is, "How do you feel about losing your face? And it'd be a shame to make your mother bury her child." This moment is genuinely palpable. The sprite work here definitely helps. I love Susie's spooky face. Regardless, we can tell that Susie doesn't really like Chris, or anybody for that matter, and is aggressive toward him because of her own insecurities. She seems to be the loner type, and after falling into the dark world, she even leaves the party in favor of trying to figure a way back out on her own. She's always been alone and thinks that she doesn't need Chris's or anyone's help for that matter. Even after meeting Ralsei, who seems to be their best chance of escape, Susie chooses to go it alone, because that's what she's used to. During battle, I noticed, for some reason, that I wasn't able to control Susie. She just attacked on her own. I thought, I mean, that's kind of weird. Maybe she just hasn't officially joined the party yet, and I mean, I was able to control Ralsei just fine once she had officially joined the party. As most other JRPGs do, characters have to join your party before you're actually able to use them. Makes sense, right? After practically being forced to join us, and a nice little joke about the traditional whole characters joining parties JRPG thing, you aren't able to control her as she just wants to axe the monsters you're fighting left and right. And if you guys are at all familiar with the Undertale fandom, that's not a very pacifist thing to do, although it doesn't seem to matter as much in Deltarune, which is a topic for a video in and of itself. Anyway, if you don't want to kill every enemy in your path, you need to make sure to warn your enemies for Susie's attack, so you can pacify them before she kills them. I absolutely love that Susie's personality was intertwined in the battle theme. She wants to do things how she wants to, and her violent nature becomes uncontrollable, even through the gameplay. Now, let's analyze Lancer, who we consider the bad guy, as he even establishes himself as one upon first encountering him. Right off the bat, we can tell he's a character meant to provide comic relief. Sure, he still causes trouble for Chris and the group, but he's really bad at being a bad guy, no pun intended. From forgetting to bring bad guys to fight the party, to bringing the wrong monsters to fight whose combo attacks don't fit well together, Lancer is just that, bad. He even starts to learn how to be evil from Susie, who's supposed to be part of the heroes, so wait a minute. Susie starts teaching Lancer how to be evil, and now honestly that was a twist I wasn't expecting. Sure, I thought Susie was going to be a pain, but I thought she'd get better. To think she'd join the bad guy. Again, although unexpected, neither of them are too great at being bad guys. It's more so that Susie and Lancer get a chance to bond and develop their relationship. Lancer looks up to Susie, and Susie ends up beginning to like Lancer, going so far as to consider themselves friends. The two build a relationship with one another, and it's endearing to see Susie finally begin to care about someone. But all good things must come to an end. After Lancer finds out that Chris, Susie, and Ralsei must fight his father, the king, in order to escape from the Dark World, he decides to imprison them as he doesn't want them to hurt his dad. Susie's able to escape from her cell, and not knowing who imprisoned them or why, confronts Lancer as to what happened. Lancer admits he was the one that imprisoned them, and Susie again reverts back to her violent nature. Realizing that she's been betrayed, she turns into her former self, and raises her axe against Lancer. What ensues is one of the most heart-wrenching sequences I've seen in a video game, as Toby knows how to tell a story through gameplay rather than cutscenes. This results in more investment from me as the player as well. We're forced to watch as Susie relentlessly attacks Lancer, causing more and more damage every turn. At one point, Lancer even stops fighting back, but Susie doesn't care. She continues to hurt Lancer to the point that he's wounded and on his last leg. He even begins shaking. But right before she's about to deliver the final blow, she misses. Susie finally has spared an enemy willingly for the first time ever in the game. Lancer then begins to explain why he imprisoned the party to Susie. And Susie, redeeming herself, explains to Lancer that they'll talk it out with Lancer's dad instead of fighting him, and their friendship is renewed. Again, this is a big turning point for Susie's character development, as this is the first time she's willingly spared an opponent rather than attacking and finishing them off. From this point on, she's no longer uncontrollable. You're able to act with her just like any other party member and are able to control her actions. Now this is how you do character development. Character development shouldn't just come from cutscenes or storytelling alone. It's truly done well when these factors are intertwined with gameplay, and that's when a character's changes and developments throughout the plot can really become impactful toward the player. That's not all. We've still got the final scene to analyze. After venturing to the top of the castle, the team must now battle the king, as he gives the party no choice. I think the king draws an interesting parallel to Susie at the beginning of the game. After the king pretends to be beaten, and cowardly attacking Ralsei after Ralsei heals him, he focuses in on Chris, acknowledging him as the leader of this group. He even picks Chris up the same way Susie did at the start of the game, and says that same line of dialogue. Quiet people piss me off. And guess who stops the king from killing Chris? Susie. In a way, by defeating the king, Susie is able to overcome her former self. She's made friends with Lancer, and Chris and Susie as well. Her sprite, whose eyes were once covered and clouded by her hair, have become more prominent and clearly seem more warm and gentle compared to her cold, harsh eyes that she had before. Finally, it's time for Chris and Susie to head back home. After promising to come back to the Dark World tomorrow, the two say their goodbyes. Now, I kind of want to focus on Chris, as I haven't really talked about him at all this whole video. Why is that? Well, there's not much to say about Chris until the epilogue. He's a pretty unimportant character throughout the Dark World section of Chapter 1. None of Chris's or the player's choices really matter throughout. There are several examples of this. Again, when attempting to name Chris, the game doesn't really give you a choice. When Susie asks you a question, she responds, "Don't bother answering." If you haven't gotten it by now, your choices don't matter. This line of dialogue seems to be talking to two people in particular, Chris and the player. As to why I think this, we'll get to that in a little bit. Still, I do think there is some characterization to Chris. We know that he lives with his brother, Asriel, and an alternate version of Toriel and Asgore. We know that Chris misses his brother, as if you drink the hot chocolate at the cafe you two always used to come to, you are met with the following dialogue. "It tasted wonderful. Your throat tightened." Usually, throat tightening implies some stress or anxiety, something definitely not associated with a drink tasting wonderful. We can only guess it's tied to some happy memories with his brother, who he doesn't really get to see any longer. It's such a subtle line of dialogue that tells us so much about Chris's relationship with his brother, Asriel, as well as his family as a whole. One of the biggest things I do want to touch on that serves to develop Chris's character as well, even though he's portrayed as the silent protagonist, is that he's not really the leader of the group or a protagonist in Deltarune at all. In fact, Susie's the one who best fits the role of the protagonist. She's the one who comes back and saves Chris and Ralsei when they're imprisoned by Lancer. After the king picks up Lancer, threatening to hurt him, Chris stands there emotionless, almost like he doesn't care, while Susie and Ralsei react to the situation and move against the king to protect Lancer. And again, we're constantly told that our choices don't matter, which is a theme that consistently shows up throughout Chapter 1. But guess whose choices do matter? Susie's. Guys, I'm about to spoil the end of Deltarune, so if you guys haven't finished the game, I advise you to go back now. But for those that have already seen the ending, let's continue. At the very end of Deltarune, we see Chris sleeping in his bedroom. He falls out of his bed almost suddenly and seems to be sleepwalking. Then we see him rip out a soul, the very essence of one's being in the Undertale universe, and throw the soul into a cage. We can assume that the soul he ripped out is the player's, as we can still control the heart from within the cage. We have no control over him while this is happening, and that's no coincidence. My best assumption is that we no longer have control over Chris, as someone, maybe Chris himself, has overpowered us, and as he manifests a knife with a sinister glow in his eye, the chapter ends. This scene helps explain why Chris seems so soulless throughout the entirety of Chapter 1. He seems to be a blank canvas that can be painted any color. As to what happened to Chris's original soul and who's in control of him now, that remains to be seen. This definitely supports the fact that I see Susie being the protagonist of Deltarune's remaining chapters over Chris, as I see him taking more of an enemy role. Honestly guys, this is how you do character development. Subtle, nuanced details that can give us layers of characterization, and that is abundant in Deltarune. From how Susie's character was intertwined in the battle theme, to Chris's characterization by the single line of dialogue after drinking the hot chocolate, to Susie's heart-wrenching battle with Lancer, there are so many well-done examples of these details throughout Deltarune, and I'm so incredibly excited to see what future chapters will bring to the table in terms of character development and storytelling, and so much more. Anyway guys, that's going to be all for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed. Make sure to subscribe or Chris is going to rip out your soul, and I will see you all in the next video.
Don't forget, I'm with you in the dark.